Hi, Reid.
Hi, Bob.
How you doing?
Good. It's kind of a busy December, but things are cooking along.
I would suspect that all your Decembers are busy. Let me explain why when I introduce us. I'm Robert Wright. This is The Wright Show, available on both streaming video and via audio podcast. You are Reid Hoffman. I'm sure to a lot of people you need no introduction. You're a very well-known entrepreneur and investor. You co-founded LinkedIn, for example. You are an early-stage investor in Facebook and Airbnb and so on. You're a general partner at a big VC firm there in Silicon Valley, Greylock. You have also written books. You wrote co-authored a book with our mutual friend Ben Casnocha called The Startup of You, bestseller. More recently, in fact, very recently, you've written the book we're going to talk about, co-authored with Chris Ye. Is that the way he pronounces his?
That is indeed.
Blitzscaling, the lightning fast path to building massively valuable companies. Before we get into that, I want to mention one other thing you've done, which is that your foundation has provided philanthropic support for Meaning of Life.tv, which is a sister site of what this show will be on Blogging Heads.tv. They're both operated by Nonzero Foundation, which I run. So if astute viewers see signs that I'm being suspiciously nice to you, it's like watching Trump for signs that he's being nice to Russia. Except that I'm upfront about everything. That's the difference.
And you don't go fake news at any time a fact is showing that you have corruption.
People differ about my degree of honesty, actually, so I can't comment on that. But I try not to. I'm anti-fake news. So,
let me add one thing to the bio, just because we're doing a podcast, which is I'm also, of course, the host of Masters of Scale, which is another podcast.
Yeah, and which is very much related to this book, actually. In fact, I would, reading the book, I would guess that you did a certain amount of research while doing the podcast, right?
100%. Actually, one of the things that I've learned in doing this is if you're going to do a nonfiction book and you're going to do research where you talk to other people, you should do a podcast in that research. It just now, I think it's just a straightforward evolution of the medium.
Yeah. No, that there is a real efficiency there, which is interesting because one of the things in the book that kind of surprised me early on is, in a certain sense, you champion inefficiency. I won't elaborate on that right now. I'll leave that as keeping people on the edge of their seats. I want to say a couple of other things about the book by way of introduction, though. One is that, so blitzscaling is about growing very, very, very fast for companies for whom that makes sense. But the book touches on more things than that because, for one thing, I run a very small organization that has so far shown no signs of blitzscaling, sadly. And I was, there were a lot of things in the book that made me think about how I'm running my shop. So it's not just for companies that are growing very fast. The other thing is that there are a couple of ways that it kind of intersects with the whole Silicon Valley thing generally. I mean, first of all, it's very much a Silicon Valley book. You're a Silicon Valley person. And of course, the backdrop of anything about Silicon Valley these days is that Silicon Valley is not held in the universally high repute that it might have once hoped to have been held in. And you actually address that a little bit at the end of the book, in a way. But what I want to talk about that near the end. The other thing, though, the other kind of connection to Silicon Valley is just that. The reason that blitzscaling is a thing, the reason that for some companies growing very, very fast might be the difference between total world domination and death, is because of certain dynamics that I think have in a way made Silicon Valley what it is. And I'm thinking particularly of so-called network effects, positive network externalities, right? The idea that the more people on the network, the more valuable it is to be a member of the network. That is it safe to say? I mean, that's a pretty abstract thing, and you don't. And yet, is it safe to say that for a diverse range of companies that have come out of Silicon Valley, ranging from Airbnb to Facebook to LinkedIn, your thing, that is a super key thing that was less true of ventures 100 years ago.
Well, certainly 100 years ago, because, the canonical definition of network effects actually goes around fax machines, right? Because, each new fax machine that you have on, makes the whole system of fax machines much more valuable, makes it means by which you can communicate documents, legal documents, contracts, and a whole bunch of other things. And so the fact that that's the reason why people still do like scan PDFs and email PDFs, like fax machines live on now with smartphones taking pictures of physical documents that you sign.
Right.
And so that's kind of where network effects, at least in certain ways, kick in. But like network effects, like for example, Microsoft with the file format in productivity software was a form of network effect. The applications to Windows OS was another network effect. So network effects aren't just when you get to Airbnb and when you get to Facebook and when you get to LinkedIn and when you get to Google. It's been a phenomenon all along, but part of it as we get to a more kind of a globally networked world, as the internet connects everything together, both in life and work, businesses with network effects both there are more of them, become more prominent, become more like faster to establish. And so some of those patterns, some of the goes from a napkin idea to a world transforming, industry transforming company, right, within a decade. All of that is because the world is more networked, and those network effects are what makes that happen.
Right. And there's different kinds of network effects, so to speak. There's a kind that I forget the term you used, but it's a kind of like a two-sided network effect where, and I think Microsoft, would that kind of be an example of this? And we should say, I mean, LinkedIn was bought by Microsoft, so you're now on the board of Microsoft, so you should know. Yes. Congratulations on that. If Microsoft wants to buy anything of mine, you have my email address. But the more people there are with the Windows operating system, then the more companies out there are that will make apps for the operating system, which in turn makes it more valuable to be a member of the network in terms of an operating system owner, which in turn makes it more worthwhile to make apps. I mean, there are these kinds of like mutual feedback effects. And then there's some that are more kind of one-dimensional. So I guess like, actually LinkedIn is an interesting example because it turned out there were two-sided effects, but was that necessarily anticipated? Do you know what I mean? You know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
You want to talk about LinkedIn because it's one of the themes in the book is how kind of agile you have to be, and surprises arise about where things, money and feedback and so on might come from. But you want to talk about getting LinkedIn off the ground?
So there's at least two kinds of network effects in LinkedIn. So one is a network where you're inviting people because the people you're connected to help make the information that you see, like when you see your news feed, the people who might find you as kind of 2 degrees away, or the people you might find 2 degrees away, each of that become the utility curve goes up the more people you're connected to. So there's an incentive to be connected to a number of people as an individual, saying these are the people I trust and work with and do things. So that's one network effect. The other network effect is between in the recruiting business and the job seeking business. The more people you have on that are hiring managers, recruiters, other kinds of things for the kind of talent and kind of the job opportunities, the work opportunities, the business development opportunities, and the people looking for it, you then get a marketplace, a two-sided network effect, because finding that when you're really looking for is what's the best job opportunity, what's the most appropriate job opportunity, what's the best business opportunity, what's the most appropriate job business opportunity. The difference between 1 and 2 may be very, very big. And so when you have actually the density of the network and you have the diversity in the network on a two-sided marketplace, then what happens is both sides just keep coming back to the same marketplace.
Right.
Many people are probably familiar with eBay and Airbnb. So eBay, you kind of go, all right, well, I'm looking for a specific kind of, Furby that used to be made. Well, a diversity is most likely, so I go to eBay for that. For Airbnb, it's like, well, I'm looking for the apartment that has a really nice view of the river. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So where are the places that have the most apartments? Of course, part of the reason why Airbnb has the most apartments is because it has enough people go there that when people are listing an apartment, they go, well, Airbnb is where all the interesting people are showing up in order to rent the apartment. So I'll list it on Airbnb.
Mm-hmm.
That's the cycle that gets into a two-sided marketplace.
Right. And in the case of Airbnb, I think they pretty much had to envision that was the dynamic they were looking for. But in the case of LinkedIn, was it a little bit of a surprise to you that companies started using it as a recruiting ground, as a place to find talent, which turned out to be a critical part of the growth, right?
Well, not as much the growth, but economic growth and business model.
Right.
We knew both. I'm a huge student of network effects and networks. So I knew that this network effect would get established. I knew that it would be companies and individuals. What I didn't know was timing. So my expectation was that the first major business model of LinkedIn would be that you're expensing, like an individual comes and uses it for recruiting, for finding business development deals, partnerships, finding financing, like all those things. And they say, I'm selling, I'm using LinkedIn for that, and I expense it to my company. Mm-hmm. So we thought it was going to be individual subscriptions expense the company. And so that's the product we built first. When we built that product, we started getting a lot of inquiries from companies. I thought we'd get those companies at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years out. We started literally getting them the second week, right? Mm-hmm. And what is one of the things that's kind of classic Silicon Valley pattern of because part of underlying entrepreneurship, and then also it ties into ability to scale quickly. We went, okay, how do we test what the demand looks like as quickly and as effectively as possible? And so what we literally did is we had a designer make a bunch of mock-ups on paper about this is the product we're working on, right? Like this is what the enterprise product looks like. We hired one salesperson, and we sent that salesperson out in the field with a little sheet with paper, right? Saying, so this is the product we're working on. Would this product be interested? What would you pay for it, and so forth? And then the sales guy came back and said, oh my God, there's a huge amount of demand. We need to build this product. And so then we took a third of our engineering team, half of our product managers, and we shifted them over and started building that product really fast. And that was the surprise, not the network effect, not the fact that was a serious source of revenue, but when it started.
Okay. And for network effects to kick in, you usually have to reach some kind of critical mass, right? And there are different ways to do that. So like with Facebook, in retrospect, that was just tailor-made. It was just, Harvard is a local community. There already was a thing called Facebook. That's what it, there was a book with faces in it. And so like they built it in a local community where it's not so hard to stir up awareness of something. And then it kind of spread from campus to campus. Some of its current critics might say metastasized from campus to campus, but in any event, it spread from campus to campus. And made sense that it starts from, it starts at an elite campus, and I guess everybody wants to be like people at Harvard. Anyway, that makes perfect sense. With LinkedIn, I've always thought it might have been more of a challenge to get to critical mass. There wasn't some kind of tailor-made situation like that. I gather a big thing. We've all seen this question from LinkedIn. Do you want to share your email contacts with us? Right? Me being an introvert or something, I've always said no. I'm always like, but wait, do my friends want anyway? But how critical was that? I mean, it was totally upfront. You weren't doing anything sneaky, as has in some other cases allegedly been done. But what was that? How critical was that?
Totally critical. Now, one thing, and it's a little bit like as we get to the responsible blitzscaling chapter that you were referring to earlier. One of the things that we did at LinkedIn always is we said, okay, we may have secret plans, we may have secret things that we're doing because we don't want competitors to know them, that kind of thing. But the tempo was, if what you're doing couldn't be printed on the front page of the New York Times, and you couldn't go and kind of, have dinner with your friends and hold your head up and say, no, this is why it's good for people. This is why, like this is why what we're doing is actually good for people. Then don't do it. And so what we would do is we'd say, hey, would you like to upload your address book, your email contacts? And the reason that we give you, because it's true, what we deliver is we'll tell you who else you know who's here. Because especially in the early days, but even now, people kind of go, when they first come to a network, they go, well, who else is here? Is this network for me? Is this where my colleagues are, my friends are, the people that I hang with, the people that I want to hang with? Are those folks here? And so we weren't the inventor of the check the email, kind of the upload your email address functionality. That was earlier. But what we were the inventor of was upload your email to see who else you knew who was here. And so we would do that, and enough people would do that because they would be interested in that then got you your growth curve. Because you don't need to have everyone do that. It's perfectly fine if Bob the introvert goes, like, I have no idea what this is, and I'm not sure, so forth and so on. That's totally fine. Because, by the way, people who know you, right, upload their and they go, oh, Bob's here. And then they send out a connection saying, hey, Bob, right? I'm on LinkedIn too. And that was what caused the growth to go.
Okay. And you were in the game early. I mean, you were in the social network game very early because you had a startup. I forget what it was called, like
SocialNet.
Socialnet.com.
Yes.
And this is like when? What year? This is
1997.
So this was before any of us had heard of social networks in the modern sense of the term, I think. I mean, maybe Friendster. Did Friendster exist? Friendster existed.
Nope.
That was before Friendster's.
Friendster's 2002.
Which is that what LinkedIn is as well? 2002 or?
Nope. LinkedIn is 2003.
So that's early in the game too. Anyway, so you had been in the, you had a thing that didn't pan out. This first social network attempt, kind of, I guess, ahead of its time. But LinkedIn was very early. When was Facebook founded?
Facebook was 2004, I believe.
Okay, so this is before Facebook, very Facebook-like in the dynamics at work, except you had some additional things like the companies wanting to use it as a recruiting ground. But it was, congratulations. That's impressive. Now, I mentioned inefficiency, and I guess we have covered clearly enough the idea that, well, let's put a finer point on it. So because of network effects, things can grow very rapidly, and also because of network effects, sometimes things have to grow rapidly or you die. In other words, there's a space that's going to be dominated by someone once they get the picture, and it's in the nature of these things that network effects are so powerful that once somebody has dominated the field, it's just way more valuable to be a member of that existing network than to jump ship and be a member of your fledgling network, precisely because it's a small network, and so it's less valuable to be a member. It has turned out to be more possible than I might have imagined to create competition. So, for example, at one point I thought, well, Facebook will be here for 1,000 years, and it may still be, but it turned out that kind of oblique angles of entry, like Instagram, who would have thought that it seemed like a quirky photo sharing site, turned out it could be a rival to Facebook. Facebook wisely bought it. But anyway, the point is, the dynamic is, in certain spaces, it's grow or die. And if you're the one who grows, you may become very, very valuable and have very strong defensive perimeters, right?
Yep. So let me say three things. The first is the precise definition of blitzscaling in a compact form is prioritizing speed over efficiency in an environment of uncertainty.
Right.
And so the question is, how do you get big very fast, but not just kind of like the internet boom? It's how do you get the right strategic position, the right set of customers, possibly the broadest set of customers, sometimes within one market, sometimes within kind of the world. And then you pay two big prices for it. You pay a price in efficiency. Efficiency could be capital spend. It's things like what you see with Airbnb and Uber. It could be in human capital. You're hiring widely. You're not managing your company efficiently, et cetera. You may not understand fully your business model. And then uncertainty, where you don't know what the competition's doing. You don't know necessarily what your customer acquisition costs, your unit economics, and so forth are to plug into that. And you pay those costs in inefficiency and uncertainty because we're in what we call Glengarry Glen Ross markets, which is first prize Cadillac, second prize steak knives, third prize you're fired. So that's blitzscaling in a nutshell. Now, part of the thing that's interesting is you generally tend to do blitzscaling when you have network effects. But network effects are not kind of like the universal panacea. If platforms change, then network effects don't apply as much. So part of, for example, Facebook to Instagram, and part of the reason why Zuckerberg was very smart, bought Instagram early, was that you had this move from desktop to mobile. And in a move from desktop to mobile, you're creating a new network on mobile. And so even though it's pictures with your friends and so forth and so on, and even though you had been getting a bunch of pictures within Facebook, because everyone had phones now on their phone, cameras on their phones, now it was like, okay, well, there's this new platform in Medium, and so going and participating in that very fast, in this case by acquisitions, was what made both Instagram and WhatsApp really smart acquisitions by Facebook, right? Because one, they had the kind of the feed of pictures, and the other one is they had communications. And going back to your very earliest thing about Facebook, yes, that we had these Facebooks, but part of the invention in Facebook was communications and messaging that ties that to not just have a picture of, where does Bob or Sue live, right? And who are they, and maybe which state did they come from, but ability to communicate with them, send them messages, inventing things like news feeds and other kinds of things were all part of that. But then those also, of course, communications products classically lock in the network effects. Also, because there's sometimes multiple network effects that loop into any business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hadn't actually thought clearly about the fact that what made Instagram, and for that matter, WhatsApp threats, was that there was a shift in platform. It's because people were suddenly using devices that were fundamentally messaging devices and that had cameras and that were following them everywhere, that you get a threat to the Facebook model that it needs to do something about. It did a little of both, actually. I mean, it adapted the Facebook model itself, but it also bought a couple of potential rivals. So that's interesting. I mean, the need for agility and the role of happenstance comes through in the book. And also, I mean, in your podcast, in your Masters of Scale podcast, you interviewed the guy who started Instagram. I forget his name, but
Kevin Systrom.
Yeah, fascinating guy. And I remember just how, like, when he first started out, he has a pretty artistic sensibility in some ways. And it was like, he did not have in mind the business model that worked. I forget, his wife gave him some key insight about maybe she used filters. Was that it? He was a filter. And it's I guess you could say there's two. It seems to be almost standard procedure that these companies that succeed wind up doing something other than what they started doing. And there's two ways that can happen. One is it's planned, like Netflix, which you talk about in the book. And like they started out shipping DVDs, but Reid Hastings knew, I gather from the beginning, that he ultimately wanted to get into the streaming business. It's just that you didn't have the bandwidth yet. So that's like genius. And then there's the I guess one question is, which is more common? Is it more common to just kind of adapt and react your way through the circuitous path to some new thing that wasn't clear at the beginning? Or isn't it, my sense is almost that it's actually kind of rare that the thing is planned?
So usually it's some combination. So usually there are some very key elements in insights, like a shift from platform, or moves from desktop to mobile, or platforms are sometimes subtle, like a shift to cloud. Like we have a lot more cloud computing. So you're shifting from desktop software to software in the cloud, and how that changes things. And that is part of that shift in platforming is a shift to artificial intelligence and data. And so those things are usually part of the insight. Those things are usually part of the why a amazing entrepreneur says the time for this idea is now. But then most often, not 100%, but most often, there's also serendipity. There's also we discovered, this works, right? But by the way, part of good entrepreneurs is that they're trying to maximize their chances of hitting serendipity by catching the right kind of technological changes, by catching the right kind of market changes. And so, for example, Kevin Scott, who's now the CTO of Microsoft, was working at AdMob, which is advertising on mobile phones. And part of what they did is they saw the iPhone and they were like, oh my gosh, like we had been thinking that there was going to be advertising on mobile phones. This is the platform. And they pivoted the entire company, right, to be the launch, like we're the first one with ads, right, on the iPhone in order to make this work. And that's part of what enabled them to capture the early market, get bought by Google, and that's part of the recognition of that serendipity, and the realization of it also goes into the kind of strategic planning, even though you didn't know you were going to have that serendipity on your first kind of recognition of the idea.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now, there was also another interesting story is one you were closely involved in, which is PayPal, which kind of, you were one of the several, PayPal was like an incubator for now well-known people, right? So you were the chief operating officer, and I think you were on the board. Peter Thiel was there. Was Elon Musk there?
Elon,
or was he acquired?
Well, PayPal and X.com, which Elon had founded, had merged, and so we treat the three the three of Peter Thiel, Max Levchin, and Elon Musk as the founders of PayPal.
Okay. And was Pierre Omidyar involved in that? He founded eBay. Did he have any?
He founded eBay, and eBay bought PayPal.
Okay, that's the connection there. So anyway, you were at PayPal early on, and one thing in the book that kind of surprised me was that before, and it's a reminder of how you kind of forget how the different technologies unfolded. But before, do I have this right, that before you thought about transferring money via email, you thought the key was going to be doing it via Palm Pilot? And if people, for our younger viewers and listeners, we may have to explain, Palm Pilot was a kind of a precursor in some ways of the iPhone. It was a mobile device that existed before there was much in the way of connectivity. People were using them before they were using email. Right. And the main function of it, actually, the main communication was with your computer. That was pretty much it. It was a way to take like your calendar and stuff from your computer and have it with you. And so you would sync it with your computer, but you didn't. And then you could use, what's the technology? Not Bluetooth, but to communicate among Palm Pilots, you could do, there was something, and that was what you were banking. I was like, maybe people will meet and give money to each other via their two Palm Pilots with this this close range communication technology. You know what it is. I don't. But no, there weren't enough of them. It's like there not being enough fax machines. It's like it wasn't a big enough network for that to work.
Well, this is a classic kind of Silicon Valley entrepreneurial story, which does involve both an idea and then serendipity. PayPal is probably one of the ones that most got to a very different realization from a kind of a set of ideas. So it started with encryption on mobile phones. And this is pre any smartphones. And it's very hard to do because of power and battery and kind of CPU, because encryption is, generally speaking, you run your CPU a lot on a lot of electricity in order to build up enough encryption. And you can't do that on mobile phones. More easily now, but it's still always more constrained. Then it went to, well, what's our use case? Well, it should be cash. So we'll do cash on mobile phones. Oh, cash on mobile phones will take us 3 years, so we can't do that. Let's do the Palm Pilot, right? part of what happened is, this is when I was on the board of PayPal. I told Peter and Max, I said, look, I figured out why this is not going to work, because even though we're here in Silicon Valley, which is Palm Pilot Central, but your central use case is splitting the dinner tab. And so you go to every restaurant, and my guess is that you'll be lucky to find some restaurants that have a table where everyone has a Palm Pilot where they can do that. So you're guaranteed that your use case is not going to work, your primary use case. And Max Levchin said, well, that's easy. We can sync through email payments and do email payments. And we're like, oh, that's a good idea. So it launched with both the Palm Pilot and doing essentially beaming, which is kind of Bluetooth technology, and with the email payments. The email payments took off on eBay. So we shut down the Palm Pilot and focused entirely on essentially doing payments through essentially email as an identifier, saying essentially, like, I can wire you money to your email address, right? And then that became and the reason that took off is that there was this marketplace called eBay that hadn't figured out electronic payments, and so people were paying each other with money orders and checks and so forth, which was decades out of date, right? And so they were doing that, and so that's what got it to enough critical mass, which then, of course, also created network effects, and that's part of the PayPal journey. So
in a way, PayPal and eBay became two sides of a two-sided network effects dynamic.
Well, they're not two sides. They were two different two-sided networks that.
Right. I mean, it was an unusual case where it was actually two different companies, but you had that kind of dynamic that sometimes you have kind of within a company, so to speak, right? Where, you know what I mean? There's a feedback effect between these two entities that make both grow.
Yes. Compounding loops.
Yeah.
And sometimes, by the way, viral loops is another way. There's a book, I think, by that name, but viral loops is another way that that Silicon Valley people talk about it, because the math that describes epidemiology and the spread of a virus is also the math by which you get these compounding loops working, both for spread, like, go and invite other people into the network, and also engagement. Yeah.
And there was a kind of a viral marketing plan that I gather was key for PayPal. It was you incentivized people to go recruit their friends to the network, kind of, right, by giving them a big discount, and you were swallowing a big loss yourself in the name of that.
Well, actually, that was just straight out clever. So back in 2000, when PayPal was growing, the usual pattern for acquiring users, and this is part of what gave Yahoo and some other early sites their massive revenue, because it was basically a backup the venture capital truck and dump it into advertising on Yahoo, was you would buy advertising on Yahoo, and that would be like $30 or $40 or $50 or $100 or $200 per user to advertise on Yahoo and get those users to sign up for your service. And that was your primary way. And so part of what the PayPal team had this kind of clever idea to do was to say, well, I'll get $10 and you get $10 when I invite you into PayPal and you sign up. So now you say, okay, well, what's the blended cost of that? Well, the blended cost of that's maybe, depends a little bit on certain dynamics, $15, $17, per new user, et cetera. Depends a little bit on several people send you, only one person gets the benefit for when you sign up, but several people send you the emails and doing it and so forth. And so, but then you're then connected to them. And so that was, call it sub $20 as a cost of acquisition, which is much cheaper than the cost of acquisition advertising. So that was not actually, in fact,
I see.
That was just smart. The real thing that caused a lot of expense in PayPal was that we had an exponentiating usage line of people using credit cards to do payments, and we were giving out free credit card, which is 3% per transaction. So in that mode, it was the classic crazy internet boom business, which is like the more we're used, the more we lose money, right?
Right. But that's what you prescribed. I mean, in the book, that gets back to like swallowing inefficiency can be an important part of growth. Of course, there's also the term in the book, blitzscaling, and it's in the nature of this game that not everyone's going to win. And in fact, what VC firms do in Silicon Valley is, I gather they focus on the kinds of markets where if you do win, you'll win big. And that allows them to bet on, to settle for the possibility that most of the companies they bet on will fail, but they'll still wind up making money, right? Because if the ones that win will win big. That's a big part of the whole Silicon Valley finance dynamic, right?
Yep, exactly. And so, like, for example, I don't have this exactly, but I was told that one of the Kleiner Perkins funds had 30 investments, 29 of them went to zero. The 30th was Google. And so it's a Hall of Fame venture fund. Right. And so that's an extreme example of it. But that kind of thing of the big high flying outcomes are the things that make these funds interesting to invest in.
Mm-hmm. So, there's a lot in the book. You talk about nurturing companies through the growth stages. You have these stages. You go from like family, tribe, village, city, nation, and so on. I think something like that. You get different challenges at each stage, and and this is where some of this had me thinking. Even though I have managed to stay in the family level for possibly record-setting 12 years, because before this was a nonprofit, it was a nominally for-profit thing. So if you put it all together, I've been I have not blitz failed because I haven't tried to blitz scale, but blitz something other than scaled. And there was a lot of that made me think about dealing with employees. I mean, you wrote a book about this with Ben Kasnoka and this co-author Appreciate called The Alliance about relations with employees. But I guess one question is, as a company grows, to what extent can you avoid the brutality? In other words, the just coldly. I remember hearing Jack Welch, who was the famously successful head of GE for a long time, years and years ago on the radio. He was saying, like, I just tell him, like, when he's firing people, it's like, you're doing yourself a favor. If you're not thriving here, you shouldn't be here. You should be, I'm doing you a favor. And I thought, that's a lot easier for you to say than for them to say. You're still firing them and they've got to find a damn job. You get into the business a little of, for you, that's kind of a last resort, right? In other words, people, as a company grows, a person who is valuable may suddenly not have a place in your company, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And so, part of the thing about blitzscaling companies is that there's a lot of internal management chaos where you have a set of counterintuitive rules in the book that are this is what's different than what's taught in business school, right? Ignore your customers.
And by the way, you taught this as a course at Stanford, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Stanford Engineering in the CS department.
Okay.
But and it's online. I think you can find it at the Greylock website and other places. It's on YouTube in various ways. Mm-hmm. And so, but we have all these kind of counterintuitive rules where the principal point of these counterintuitive rules is say, here's what you think is received wisdom in business. Here's what's taught in business schools. And here, in order to play this game of prioritizing speed over efficiency and uncertainty, are specific things you might do. Now, unfortunately, it does lead to a lot of stress in the company and in people's lives and so forth. And so it has to be something that's worth doing. And obviously, part of the reason why it's worth doing for individuals is the way the Silicon Valley game works is that the vast majority, usually all of the people working there, get stock options. And if the stock goes up a lot, it's usually an economically life-changing game because you've created this very valuable business. But it can lead to you work at the company for a year and then there's no longer a place. And, part of this is kind of a theme a bit in my writings, like part of the point on the Alliance, which is the second book, is to say, look, people may have a tour of duty where they kind of say, look, we may only do this for a year. We may only do this for 2 years. But here's how we can do it in the most human way. Here's how we can help the employee. Here's how we can be honest and upfront and kind of collaborative in what's going on. And so obviously part of the Alliance and certain patterns of it are part of what actually make the human factors, the talent part of blitzscaling work by having those. Now, frequently, a blitzscaling companies only really get rid of employees when they don't fit the culture or they're not learning the new game or something, because usually you're acquiring new people. So as long as you're kind of embracing the chaos and making yourself useful, usually during the blitzscaling stuff, there's usually not as many kind of redundancies or trades. Usually that kind of thing happens when you're beginning to tune up efficiency in a company, which all companies get to, because you go, okay, we played the blitzscaling phase, and now we're going to tune towards efficiency. And are you now part of the new efficient game? Okay.
Now, kind of related to this, related to the way, handling of employees, relationships with employees is inevitably your own personality, right? I mean, I don't know enough like Silicon Valley potentates to really be able to judge, but you strike me as not necessarily typical. I mean, you got like a master's in philosophy from Oxford or something. You didn't seem to start out bent on total world commercial domination. And you're a very gregarious person. I'm sure many are there in Silicon Valley, but I get the sense, I don't know you that well, I get the sense that you don't take friendship as a merely instrumental utilitarian thing. You like to do the whole full three-dimensional friendship thing. You like to play games. You like to play Settlers of Catan, although it should be noted that victory in that game is total world domination of an in some ways capitalist system. But anyway, you seem to like to, you don't seem like the stereotypical nerd. Has that, well, first of all, do you think I'm right? Do you think you're really unusual? And secondly, does that come into play? Is it either an asset? Is your personality either an asset or a liability, or is this whole business to some extent personality neutral? And if they read your book, it doesn't matter what kind of person they are?
Well, let's see. So I think there are lots of interesting, unique people here. I think most of the entrepreneurs do tend to be driven and unique in some way. I think I'm probably the philosopher, the entrepreneur who has a philosophy degree in terms of uniqueness. I also think that I'm in the set of people here who think more deeply about the nature of that we're social animals, we're political animals. How does society come together? How do governance systems work? How does this change the patterns of human interactions versus just the depth of technology? But like another person, I think in that vein is Pierre Midyar, who I think is awesome in this arena. Mm-hmm. And so I do think the thing that's interesting about entrepreneurs is they're driven and have some unique ideas that play to market opportunities, to deploying new technologies, to learning all of the different things. You have to be an infinite learner in order to do the entrepreneurial thing. So there's a whole set of things that lead to that. Plus, as per earlier conversation, serendipity and luck in each of the cases. And so what I would say is, for me, as per your question, I think it's both. There's places where it's kind of a pretty interesting, unique asset. I have active theories of human nature. That's one of the things I do to kind of wake people up when they say, like, how are you such a great investor? I say, well, I invest in one or more of the 7 deadly sins. And, they're expecting profit and loss statements and I can spot momentum and I know this technology stuff, which, some of that stuff I know too, but that's the way of kind of thinking more broadly about it. And those kinds of things are assets. Now, on the other hand, people who tend to be the strongest and the best tend to be I wake up on Saturday morning thinking about how do I build a really great business. And I'm very interested in building great businesses, but I'm also, I'm more interested in building great societies and kind of how humanity evolves at scale. What are all the various things, including commercial stuff? How does that play into helping us become more of what we aspire to in humanity, right? Mm-hmm. Compassionate, wise, thoughtful, knowledgeable, those kinds of attributes. One of the reasons why I love reading your books and part of why I reached out and we met, years back, And so those things then create a little bit of a disadvantage in the business arena because I'm not as laser focused on that because I have this broader kind of range of interest. Now, one other thing, just as kind of an intellectual undercurrent, there's a classic pattern on kind of progressivism to sound anti-capitalist. And actually, in fact, I think managed capitalism is a form of technology. It's the best technology we've found thus far for creating prosperity. Obviously, we need to work on its impacts in climate change, always trying to figure out how to make it more human, and how does it play in the human societies, and how does it help with the human evolution. But like, for example, productivity in terms of being able to afford leisure time and education and medicine and technological innovation, all the rest of those things. And so I would say that I'm also, kind of strongly in the progressive side. I am also a strong believer in how do you deploy and utilize capitalism as a technology for that. And then the last little kind of entertaining, because I think this may be for your listeners good. Obviously, in part of being a progressive is I made a knockoff of the Cards Against Humanity game called Trumped Up Cards. Right, and that's again trying to kind of catalyze, using bits of technology. In this case, it's the ability to deliver these things through online to say, here's how I'm highlighting the absurdity of our current political system. Mm-hmm. And so, anyway, our current political regime.
Yeah, and in fact, I mean, you do have a reputation for being a progressive. In fact, for a while, I think, and I guess it would still make sense, but you and Peter Thiel, whom you've known for a long time, were held up as kind of bookends, I guess, ideologically in Silicon Valley. He's very much a straight libertarian, I guess, or pretty close to that. Well, yeah, so I had said we'd get around to this, and indeed we have. Some of the issues you raise near the end of the book about, ethical issues about public service and the public good that naturally arise if you're going to become a big, powerful anything, certainly a big, powerful company. You mentioned invest in the 7 deadly sins. It's funny. I think social networks like Facebook in particular, but also Twitter, I don't think they ever said to themselves, let's appeal to any of the particularly unfortunate parts of human nature. But it can happen kind of naturally if you're trying to facilitate maximal sharing, which you kind of naturally tend to do if you're trying to maximize revenue, right? It just turns out that, and particularly in a politically polarized environment, you can get the things people will click most rapidly on is the demonization of the other side. And that leads to a lot of the spread of fake news is not really intentional. It's like leaving aside fake, just kind of dubious, sketchy news that may not be out and out fabrication, but is really misleading. People share it assuming it's true because they want it to be true because they hate the other side so much. That's just one example of how kind of challenging this is, because you expect companies to try to maximize revenue. In the realm of social networks, that means get them to share and click. If you so if I said to Facebook or Twitter, hey, how about you have a pause and think button so that you click retweet and it says this will retweet in 10 seconds. If you click retweet again, they're going to go like, are you crazy? That's going to reduce our revenue by 15% or something, right? So how do you think about a problem?
I do think that one of the legitimate kind of challenges, you say, look, all we're trying to do is maximize amount of time on site, amount of interaction and so forth. And a little bit because of, this is the tongue-in-cheek thing about my saying, you invest in the 7 deadly sins. It's like, well, what is Facebook? It's vanity and sloth. What is LinkedIn? It's greed, right, et cetera. And you say, well, you do that. And by the way, one of the 7 deadly sins is wrath. Right. And that causes a lot of engagement and a lot of I'll spend more time and I'll write more and so forth. And so all you're doing is which things do I promote that do that? And you promote the things that tend to make that happen. And so I do think that one of the things that is part of what we have a section in the book in Blitzscaling to say, look, you need to move from pirate to Navy. And that's part of you're moving to more of an infrastructure. There's another chapter on responsible blitzscaling. which is, how do you think about like what are the key things you can have as which are the key major negative risks you need to pay attention to, and how do you start working on them early? This is a learning from all the blitzscaling stuff that's going on to say you can still move really fast to scale, and these are the kinds of ways that you try to do that with social responsibility. Because part of what happens with all the social networks is say, well, as we get larger and larger, we move from just an interesting product that some people are using to kind of social infrastructure. And the other parts of societal infrastructure, logistics, right, communications. And when you begin to do that, you need to have social responsibility, societal responsibility, not just individual, like, oh, my customer likes it, and they click and they say they really like it and they spend more time on it, but also your responsibility is to how society runs. And that's, I think, the transformation that we're now seeing. And in the kind of the good sense, I do see, people like Zuckerberg and Facebook, going along that learning curve. We might wish that it was faster. We might wish, right, that we hadn't hit some of the foot faults that we'd had before. Although some of those I think would be difficult for anyone to predict. The Russians are going to come hack our elections, right, using this. It certainly wouldn't have occurred to me. And I think a lot about society and social patterns and ecosystems. And so I think all of that is kind of important. And part of the reason why we put the responsible blitzscaling chapter in the book was not just one part of the blitzscaling book is to help everyone understand which technological innovations are going to be global scale in the future. What are the patterns by which society is evolving? How does this happen all around the world? And there's multiple places. And then how do we help entrepreneurship in more places than just Silicon Valley, both traditional corporations, but also other regions and so forth. But another part of the book, and this is like the responsible blitzscaling, is, well, look, we can do this game, and global competition necessitates that we do speed to scale. Because otherwise, if you say, well, I'm going to slow down and the other person doesn't, then they're the one who's going to establish the global, kind of globally transformative industry. And you say, well, I slow down because of ethics and they didn't, right? Then you have a ethical bad selection bias. So part of what we did is we said, look, here's how you can do ethics. Here's how you can do responsible blitzscaling. Here's how you can do social responsibility and keep your speed coefficient maximally high. Mm-hmm. And that's identifying which kinds of risks as you get to multi-threading in your organization, because you're scaling out your organization, making sure you're hiring some people whose job is to predict which risks and to do the nudges in order to make sure that you either prevented them or mitigated them, or you're there so that as it starts hitting, you're measuring it and you can correct against it much earlier, right? Those kinds of things are the kinds of things that should become part of the blitzscaling practice. And that's part of the reason we did this book, is to say all the people who are doing blitzscaling, here's how you can do it, also paying attention to responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, of course, classically, when companies do things that are bad for the world, I mean, often called negative externalities, governments can come in and regulate them. That's tricky here, both for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is you're dealing with information and the expression of ideas and so on, and Americans rightly get a little nervous when you start talking about the government regulating that. And then there's the fact that when you're dealing in a global environment, if there's going to be a globally dominating company, as you kind of suggested, regulation at the national level, if it's is not enough. All that's going to ensure is that none of the companies in your country wind up being the dominant thing in this market that's going to develop one way or another. So does all this mean, I mean, I could get off on my own hobby horse about the value of global governance. I won't. I'll restrain myself. But does all of this mean that more than in many industries, ethical, appealing to a sense of ethics is actually important in a way that it isn't necessarily for oil or even tobacco, where there's no big First Amendment issues raised by the government regulating these things, right?
Well, so I think what it means is there's a different and complex thicket of what the ethics are. I think all global scale companies have ethical issues. Oil companies, it's environmental ones; tobacco companies, it's health ones. Here, it's how do we communicate? How do we form our societies together in the communications and the kind of social networking side? And obviously, it's a question of like which things are, have those kind of social impact, and what are your responsibilities as a corporation to make them happen? And part of when I talk to kind of government officials about how to think about, what should be an approach here. And yes, there's all these complexities around global companies and global governance and all the rest. But I say, well, first kind of write the dashboard, right, about like what it is you would like to have as outputs, right? So, for example, it's like, well, I think that one of the problems that's happening in these networks is they're causing rage, right, and hatred, politically across the aisle, possibly enabling minority groups. So I would like to have dashboards about like where you are and then how you're trending to be better than that. I'd like those to be audited, by your auditors. And if I don't see good progress there, right, then we can talk about what regulation would need to happen. Mm-hmm. But my guess is if you said, look, we as a government are kind of telling you, we'd like you to do sentiment analysis about like if you have people who are harassing women, making threats against them, et cetera, which is a big problem across the internet. And then we'd like you to tone that down, and we'd like you to reliably make that a smaller and smaller amount of which messages or which pieces of content are seen or digested. And we'd like you to do that. And that's, and we'd like you to produce reports on that. Then that's the kind of thing that I think is totally doable. Doesn't necessarily require government regulation. It's fine if at the end of this it's kind of a question of what enables the right kind of creation of the society in the future. Mm-hmm. And one of the reasons why I tend to be hesitant about regulation is it tends to enshrine the future against the past. It's like, let's stay doing this and only this and not make the future. Mm-hmm. And that's a problem, both for what great futures we can create, but also for competition where you lose the future to other people who are making it. And so that's part of the reason why it's like, okay, let's figure out how to steer it in a way that's human evolution positive, humanity, positive, and let's figure out the best way to do that with a future in mind.
Yeah. No, and it is a challenge. I mean, as you said, I mean, one thing that happens is groups that represent a kind of minority sentiment, the extremists within one ideology, have a way of getting attention. And then the more polarized the environment is, the more the other side wants to see the extremists on the other side as typical, right? It's like, so, and it just, there's this positive feedback effect in tribalization that is very challenging.
Yes. Yeah, and I actually think part of the thing that we need to figure out in the evolution of democracy, in our evolution of society, is to say, we know that, because if you look at kind of progress, preference for non-zero sum games, for example, if we look at progress, you go, well, look, we want to actually have it so that we are constructive and we're building more of the pie, we're creating more value, we have more peace and less violence. Those are the kinds of things we want. And actually, fierce tribalism is in the exact, kind of wrong direction, which is, part of the reason why, and we're seeing this not just in the U.S., with our, president who, kind of tweets, kind of hatred and disregard, maybe every day, certainly very frequently, and, is, I think, a shameful abuse of the office, to other countries, in terms of what's going on in the destabilization and democracies that run from Turkey to Brazil. Like I'd say the kind of the harshest thing that could be said about U.S. politics right now is, we've joined some of the worst elements of what used to be the Central and South American problems, and now we have them too, because of this kind of tribalism, corruption in political office and whatnot.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, it's concerning. I guess this gives me a chance to plug my Mindful Resistance newsletter, which I subscribe to. I love it. Do you? God yes. Bless you. We need more Americans like you. But it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I mean, one thing we try to do there is just kind of present the news in a way that won't drive you crazy in counterproductive ways, among other things. So is there anything else we haven't talked about that you want to say about the book?
Well, what I would say, So, you and the crew that probably listens to this tends to be the more of the intellectual versus my guess is there's relatively few entrepreneurs who listen to your podcast in particular, because they tend to be I jump off a cliff, I assemble an airplane on the way down. It's totally pragmatic. How do I create this business working, which is by default dead, right? That's one of the expressions I'm known for, is that description of entrepreneurship. And part of what's interesting about blitzscaling is that it actually is an entirely new mode and pattern of thinking about how do we evolve this kind of the business evolution that's new and different from the classic patterns by which business schools teach, by which technology companies of the future created. And as all companies are becoming more and more technology companies, this pattern will be more and more across a number of different industries. And so it's something that we need to understand. The normal human risk pattern tends to be, slow it down or stop it. But the problem is, in global competition, you do that in your area, and that means you're seeding the industries of the future to competitive areas, competitive countries. And so you need to say, no, we're not slowing down, but we're trying to figure out how to shape and how to make it most humanity positive. And that's what essentially the goal of the book is. Mm-hmm. Here's how you can play this game, this new global game that's super important. It creates a lot of productivity, will create amazing new businesses. You might have big impacts on education, big impacts on health, big impacts on more economic prosperity. But here's the kind of ways that we need to play that game in order to shape it for the benefit of humanity.
Okay, well, that's a reasonable way to end the conversation. The book's called Blitzscaling: The Lightning Fast Path to Building Massively Valuable Companies, co-authored with Chris. Yeah, and then the podcast, Masters of Scale, very much on the same wavelength. I would think that if they like one, they'll like the other. But there's not so much redundancy that you wouldn't want to do both. The podcast I've been listening to for a while. And it's really good. So thank you. And keep doing what you're doing. And congratulations on being in Silicon Valley, where it's warmer than it is here. Correct?
Yep. Yeah. People move here for the entrepreneurship and the business, and they stay here for the weather.
Yeah. And then when people who were born in the West Coast come to the East Coast, they're like, why would someone choose to live here? And it's an excellent question. I have no answer.
Yeah, well, usually it's the quality of the academic institutions and intellectual and culture and all that. It's a different network effect, by the way. I'm sure there are. Well, it's partly pathway dependence, I guess. That's one concept that's going on here, right? Path dependence, I guess, is the term, right? Yes.
Same reason we use QWERTY keyboards.
Exactly.
Okay. Well, thanks so much, Reid. And
thank you.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much.